My name is Kevin Storr, and I am a PhD student in informatics at UC Irvine, as you might have guessed. Today, I'm sharing some findings of a research project that I led actually over the summer as a UX research intern at Google. And they sponsored the work, and the work was conducted in collaboration with Tejinder Judge at Google and Stacy Branham at UC Irvine. The paper version of the work is entitled All in the Same Boat, Trade-Offs of Voice Assistant Ownership for Mixed Visual Ability Families. So as most of you probably know, voice assistants like Google Assistant, Apple Siri, and Amazon Alexa are now widely available on a variety of digital devices, and they allow users to perform like a wide range of tasks simply by using their voice. And for users with visual impairments, the non-visual accessibility of voice assistants' voice-in, audio-out interactions has been widely hailed by the academic accessibility community and by blind advocacy groups. So for example, VAs have been shown to lead to feelings of empowerment for people with visual impairments, and they provide increased control over everyday tasks. Pradhan and colleagues found many people with visual impairments perceive voice assistants as, quote, an integral part of their everyday lives. And VAs have even been noted to have certain advantages over traditional AT, like screen readers, particularly that they're easier to learn. At the same time, there's a growing body of work that shows users without visual impairments are not quite as enthusiastic about using VAs. So a wide range of frustrations have been documented for sighted VA users. For example, their commands are often misunderstood and they need to repeat themselves. Luger and Selin found users without visual impairments perceive VAs primarily as a gimmick, and they really find that they're not as useful as they expect them to be over time. So as a consequence, VA use has been shown to decline over time until they're ultimately abandoned for users without visual impairments. But as Paul mentioned earlier during Ing's wonderful presentation, many voice assistants are used in homes where family members with and without visual impairments live together. So we wondered, how do these contrasting opinions of people with and without visual impairments affect the adoption and use of voice assistants in mixed visual ability homes, which are homes where some household members have a visual impairment and others don't? So we conducted in-depth pair interviews with 6 pairs of cohabiting intimate partners, and each interview lasted about 90 minutes. Because our criteria were more specific than many studies in this space, we conducted interviews over teleconferencing software to increase the geographical distance over which we could recruit. Participants were eligible to participate if they identified as cohabiting intimate partners, where one partner used a screen reader and the other did not. And they were required to have at least one child between the ages of 5 and 13 and to own a home-based smart speaker voice assistant. Very broadly, we asked participants how they use VAs individually, how they use VAs together with other family members, and how owning a voice assistant has affected their home on the whole. And we found that despite the previously reported differences in opinions about VAs, the primary difference between partners' use of VAs was their motivation to acquire and use them. So partners in the same household typically use VAs for very similar tasks. All of our partners perceived non-visual accessibility as their primary value, and they identified similar benefits and concerns about owning voice assistants. So because I only have so much time today, I won't be able to discuss all the implications of these findings. But if you'd like to learn more about how our work informs research on domestic technology use and the design of assistive technologies, then please read our paper and cite it if you're so inclined. Cite it if you're not inclined, I don't care. Find a way. So today I'm just going to dive into the implications of our finding that partners identified similar benefits and risks of owning voice assistants. In particular, the benefits and risks of owning voice assistants that our participants identified fell into 3 main categories. And those were potential impacts on interpersonal relationships, potential impacts on domestic labor, and on physical safety. So notably within each category, participants identified both positive and negative consequences of VA ownership. For example, voice assistants might bring us closer as a family by making shared game time more accessible. But they also may become a distraction for children whose time may be better spent interacting with family. Similarly, voice assistants can make it easier for me to create shopping lists, but they also come with additional responsibilities for monitoring my children's use. Likewise, voice assistants have the potential to make my environment more safe by providing accessible interfaces to dangerous appliances like stoves and ovens, which can pose serious threats if a user can't see their temperature setting, as actually was shared by one of our participants in our paper. But they also open opportunities for sensitive information to be leaked, or for families to be harassed by malicious actors who might gain control over home automation systems. And because it's difficult to identify a net positive or net negative value of adding voice assistants to the home amongst this web of considerations, partners typically told us that they had weighed the risks and rewards together and discussed shared values and negotiated agreements about what boundaries they would place on acceptable use of voice assistants in their home. For example, partners who were concerned about kids using VAs agreed to place voice assistants in a common space where children could be more easily monitored. And these types of negotiations aren't unique to voice assistants, and they've been documented in previous work examining non-disabled families, where families weigh a variety of considerations like cost and whether or not to limit screen time and whether children will be monitored using a device. But what is unique here to mixed visual ability families is that people with visual impairments must additionally consider and weigh their own access against these other factors. So imbalances in the risks and benefits of voice assistants for partners with and without visual impairments sometimes put partners at odds during the negotiation process. Partners with visual impairments expressed less concern in our sample about privacy implications of voice assistants than their partners, and this might be why. In other cases, we saw partners with visual impairments attempting to teach their skeptical partners how to use voice assistants in order to make them more comfortable with them. But what's important to remember here is that the concerns about VA ownership that our partners raised were really pretty significant. Will this cause my child to grow distant? Will this make more housework for me? Will this pose a risk to my family's physical safety? And so we saw many cases where the risks of performing some task using VAs were simply too high, and the family agreed not to use VAs for that purpose. But in these situations, partners with visual impairments needed to sacrifice their own access to avoid potentially negative impacts on their family. So for an example, in order to shop using voice assistants, users have to provide a credit card number. And because the finances were shared by the partners in our pairs, the potential risk of this information being exposed was also shared. So all of our pairs discussed having come to an agreement about whether or not they would shop using voice assistants, despite every single pair noting that it would be far more accessible for partners with visual impairments. Only one pair agreed to use VAs to shop, because for the others, the risk of exposed financial information was simply too high. And these findings complicate some traditional perspectives in accessible computing, which treat access primarily as a technical problem. For example, many works in accessibility examine only whether or not it's technically possible for someone with a disability to use a certain system. And recent work has begun to look beyond this definition and examine how social factors impact accessibility, especially in mixed ability settings where people with and without disabilities interact, like the households in our study. And often these works focus on the stigma associated with using a specialized device which effectively marks the user as being disabled. And others examine access conflicts which happen when a shared system is usable either to someone with a disability or to someone without a disability at a given time, which can cause tension between them. Universal usability, which is a term used to describe systems that are natively accessible to users with and without disabilities, has been proposed as a technical solution to both of these social considerations of accessibility. The logic being that since everyone uses the same system, people with disabilities won't experience additional stigma, and because everyone accesses the system the same way, direct access conflicts won't arise. But our findings suggest that even in universally usable systems like voice assistants, which were accessible to all members of our participant households, full access for people with disabilities can't be guaranteed through universal usability alone. That is, although the universal usability of voice assistants sidestepped issues of stigma and direct access conflicts, it didn't sidestep social considerations of access entirely. Other considerations like interpersonal relationships, domestic labor distribution, and household safety often made it impractical or undesirable for people with visual impairments to take full advantage of voice assistants' potential accessibility. doing so may have brought undue risk upon the household. So the level of accessibility that ultimately was provided by voice assistants was dictated not by the interface of the system or by any one individual's access needs, but by the shared risks and benefits involved in using voice assistants in the home. And because people with visual impairments in our study weren't just people with visual impairments, they were also partners, parents, and family members. They felt responsible for weighing the sanctity and security of their loved ones against their own access within the home. And this finding serves as a valuable reminder of previous calls within the accessible computing literature that designing appropriate accessibility tools for and with people with disabilities involves considering holistic perspectives of their lives and not just individual accessibility needs. And we found that this may be especially pertinent when designing systems for homes where adopting a device involves risks and rewards that are shared amongst all family members, who, as one participant reminded us, are all in the same boat. So with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators at Google and at Irvine, and thank you for your attention, and then open the floor to questions.